It's 7:42 on the cold morning of March 14th, 1941. A thin layer of mist drifted across the runway of RAF Kenley. Beatrice "Tilly" Schilling stood silently near the dispersal pad, her leather coat glistening with dew, her gaze fixed on a hurricane warming up for takeoff. The roar of the Merlin engine echoed across the airfield, the same engine that had been betraying British pilots for months. At 32, with 6 years of engineering work behind her and no solution that had yet saved a single life, she looked at that plane and knew that this morning might decide her career or end it. The young pilot climbing into the cockpit was Squadron Leader Davies, 24 years old, veteran of 41 missions, survivor of 2 engine failures. He didn't know who she was, probably thought she was someone's assistant, maybe a secretary sent to take notes. He had no idea that the woman standing quietly in the cold was the Royal Aircraft Establishment's leading expert on carburetor systems, and that in her leather satchel lay a brass disc so small and so simple that it might just alter the course of the war. The problem had started the year before, the kind of invisible flaw that kills without warning. When a Spitfire or Hurricane dived to attack a German Bf-109, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine choked. The carburetor flooded under -G, fuel surged upward, starving the jet. The engine cut out for 1.5 seconds. On paper, it sounded trivial. In combat, it was death. In that heartbeat of silence, the Messerschmitt pilot, powered by a direct-injection Daimler-Benz DB601, could roll, dive, and fire with unbroken power. British pilots had no chance. The Luftwaffe knew it, and they used it ruthlessly, baiting Spitfires into dives and then circling back as the British engines died mid-air. The Royal Air Force had lost 50 aircraft in 2 weeks to this single flaw, a mechanical weakness that no amount of bravery could overcome. Schilling had spent 11 months searching for an answer. The official engineers at Rolls-Royce were developing a new pressure carburetor, but it was years away, 1943 at best. Pilots were dying now. Every morning she read the reports. Engine cut during dive, pilot killed, carburetor failure. The Air Ministry demanded patience. Schilling had run out of it. Her idea came not from textbooks, but from instinct, the same instinct that once made her one of the fastest motorcycle racers in Britain. As a teenager, she had bought a Norton bike, stripped its 2-stroke engine to pieces, and rebuilt it from scratch. At 25, she raced it at Brooklands, reaching 106 miles per hour and earning the Gold Star, one of only 3 women in history to do so. She understood engines not as equations, but as living things, machines with moods, with limits, with personalities. When the war began, she joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment as a technical officer. She was the only woman in the engine department. The other female employee was a secretary. Her male colleagues called her Miss Schilling, half amused, half dismissive. They soon learned better. By early 1941, she'd built a small team around her at Farnborough. They tested ideas late into the night, mock fuel systems, altered floats, modified chambers. Nothing worked. Until one evening, while staring at the flow diagrams, she realized the solution wasn't complex at all. If -G made the fuel surge upward, the answer was to restrict the flow. A simple brass washer, a disc with a hole just small enough to limit the surge but large enough to feed the engine at full throttle. No new carburetor, no redesign, just one piece of brass the size of a coin. It could be made for 50 cents, installed in minutes, and potentially save thousands of lives. Her calculations were perfect. Bench tests proved it. The engine no longer flooded under simulated dives. But tests weren't combat. Schilling knew that real proof could only come from a real flight, from the roar, the G-forces, the chaos of air combat. And the Royal Air Force would never authorize an untested, unofficial modification. She would have to break the rules. That morning at Kendley, as Davies prepared for takeoff, she made her choice. With her was Sergeant William Cooper, a ground engineer who had seen too many pilots die for technical reasons. When Schilling showed him the brass washer, he didn't hesitate. Together, they opened the Hurricane's fuel line, inserted the restrictor, and welded it in place. 60 seconds of work. One forbidden act of engineering. No paperwork, no authorization. Just two people trying to save a life. As the engine roared back to life, the vibration shook the ground beneath their feet. Schilling stepped back, her pulse racing. She watched the plane accelerate, lift off, and vanish into the mist. It was no longer science. It was faith. Somewhere above the channel, Davies would soon dive, and in that dive, the brass washer would either save him or fail him completely. Back on the runway, the wind whipped at her coat. Cooper stood beside her in silence. Neither spoke. They just listened to the faint fading hum of the Merlin engine and to the weight of their own decision. For Schilling, it wasn't about rebellion or recognition. It was about survival. She had built engines all her life, but for the first time, one of them held her soul. The sky above southern England that morning was deceptively peaceful. Beyond the scattered clouds, men were dying over the channel, their machines clawing through the air in duels that lasted mere seconds. Schilling knew it too well. She had seen the combat reports, the aftermath, the grieving faces of pilots who'd watched their wingmen fall. And now, one of those pilots was testing her unauthorized invention in live combat, without knowing it existed. Squadron Leader Davies had taken off with a small brass washer hidden deep inside his engine, the restrictor, as she called it. If it worked, it would be the difference between life and death. If it failed, no one would ever find out why. At 9:37, the radio crackled to life. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Schilling froze. She raised her binoculars and squinted toward the horizon. At first, nothing, just the endless gray sky. Then she saw them, 3 dark silhouettes growing larger against the morning sun, wings level, engines roaring. Her heart skipped. All 3, no losses. The noise of the ground crew faded behind her as she watched the lead Hurricane descend, circle, and touch down. The wheels hit the tarmac, bounced once, then rolled to a stop. The Merlin engine purred steadily. No coughing, no misfires, no stall. Davies cut power, opened the canopy, and climbed out. When he turned, his expression stopped her cold. He was smiling. It was a rare sight at Kendley. Pilots didn't smile after combat. Usually they came back pale, hollow-eyed, carrying the exhaustion of men who'd stared at death. But Davies looked alive, electric, almost euphoric. Sergeant Cooper was the first to speak. "Any trouble with the engine, sir?" Davies looked from Cooper to Schilling and back again, puzzled. "Trouble," he said, laughing. "Best the Merlin's ever run. Dove on 2 Messerschmitts. Engine never missed a beat." Schilling stepped forward, her breath catching. "You dove?" she asked quietly. 400 miles an hour, Davies said, eyes wide with disbelief. "Negative G, full dive. Should have died on me halfway through, but she kept running, smooth as silk. I don't know what you did to her, but keep doing it." For a moment, no one spoke. The realization hit Schilling like a physical blow. It had worked. The restrictor had worked. Within hours, word spread through the base like wildfire. Pilots crowded the maintenance sheds whispering about the magic fix that had kept Davies' engine alive. Nobody understood how, only that it worked. When Schilling explained the restrictor, Davies didn't wait for authorization. "Put that thing in every hurricane on this station," he ordered, "today." Schilling hesitated. "It's not approved." "Then they can court-martial me after the war," Davies said. "Right now, I need my men alive." By the end of the day, Cooper had installed restrictors in 4 more hurricanes. Each took 12 minutes to fit. Disconnect the fuel line, slide the washer in place, weld, reconnect, test for leaks. That night, 5 hurricanes flew patrols with the modification, 5 machines carrying an illegal, life-saving secret into battle. Over the next 3 days, the results were impossible to ignore. 0 engine failures, 12 successful diving attacks. For the first time in 11 months, RAF pilots could pursue the enemy through a dive instead of breaking off after it. The feeling spread. Not just relief, but confidence, a kind of moral victory that no statistic could measure. Pilots who had once cursed their engines now trusted them again. The Merlin had found its wings. By March 18, 1941, the numbers told the story better than any speech could. Before the restrictor, engine failures occurred in 38% of all diving attacks. Afterward, less than 0.5%, practically 0. Fighter Command's kill-to-loss ratio soared from barely even to over 3 to 1. The Luftwaffe took notice. Their after-action reports described RAF fighters that no longer broke off attacks under -G conditions. The tactical advantage that German pilots had relied on for 2 years vanished overnight. Standing on the edge of the airfield one evening, Schilling watched a formation of Spitfires roar past in perfect synchronization. She could hear the engines singing. 12 cylinders, no hesitation, no falter. For the first time, they sounded fearless. Cooper walked up beside her, wiping oil from his hands. "You realize, ma'am, you just changed the way we fight." She didn't reply. She just smiled faintly, the wind tugging at her hair, the golden light of dusk glinting off the distant wings. Somewhere out there, young men were diving into combat, and their engines were still alive. By late March 1941, the air over southern England had become a proving ground for ingenuity. Every day, Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambled to intercept German raids, and every night, Schilling's invention quietly rewrote the rules of survival. What had started as an unauthorized experiment at one airfield was now spreading like wildfire across Fighter Command. At first, it moved through whispers, a rumor between squadrons, traded in mess halls and hangars. Then it became official. Orders arrived stamped with the Royal Air Force insignia. Install fuel restrictors immediately. Priority. Critical. Overnight, the forbidden brass washer had become a sanctioned miracle. Schilling barely slept. Her phone rang constantly. Factory engineers needed measurements, station commanders wanted more parts, Air Ministry officials demanded progress reports. But the woman who had started it all wasn't behind a desk. She was on the road, or more accurately, on her Norton motorcycle, leather coat flapping in the wind as she raced from base to base with a satchel full of brass washers and tools. She designed the modification herself, and she wasn't about to let someone else botch the installation. From dawn to dusk, she supervised the work personally. Disconnect the fuel line, insert the washer, weld it in place, check the seals, test the flow. 12 minutes per aircraft if the crew was fast. She could do it in 9. By March 26th, she reached Biggin Hill, one of the busiest fighter stations in Britain. 32 Spitfires, 21 Hurricanes, 4 squadrons in rotation, each flying multiple sorties a day. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and adrenaline. The hangars buzzed like beehives. Schilling dismounted her Norton, pulled off her goggles, and walked straight to the commanding officer, Group Captain Grace, a man who had lost 7 pilots in 2 months to engine failures. "Install them all," he said without hesitation. "Every single one." The crews worked in shifts, day and night. Sparks flew as torches cut into fuel lines. Mechanics shouted over the din of engines and grinding metal. Schilling moved among them like a conductor leading an orchestra,
her sharp eyes catching every mistake, her gloved hands pointing out every flaw. She rejected 3 restrictors on the spot because the welds weren't perfect. If it fails at altitude, the engine dies. And if the engine dies, so does the pilot. Do it again. Within 48 hours, every aircraft at Biggin Hill had been modified. Spitfires rolled out of the hangars, gleaming in the morning sun, ready for combat. The pilots stood watching, curious and skeptical. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, a Cambridge-educated engineer turned fighter ace, approached Schilling with cautious respect. "A washer," he said, almost incredulous. "You're telling me a washer solved the Merlin's carburetor problem?" She met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "Not the washer," she replied. "The physics behind it." When she explained the flow restriction, the negative G-forces, the precision of the aperture, 0.04 inches, no more, no less, Lacey smiled. "Brilliant simplicity," he said softly, "utterly brilliant." The results were immediate. The next morning, Biggin Hill's squadron scrambled to intercept a formation of Bf-109s over the channel. Not one pilot reported an engine stall. 2 days later, the same squadron destroyed 7 German aircraft in a single engagement without losing a man. The engineers at Rolls-Royce received the combat reports with disbelief. The math checked out, the physics checked out, and yet the elegance of the solution, its sheer simplicity, humbled them. 1 brass washer, 1 woman's intuition, and an entire Air Force reborn. By April, production ramped up. 600 restrictors were manufactured in the first week, 1,000 per week by May. Every Spitfire, every Hurricane, every Merlin engine in Britain would carry one. The modification could be fitted without grounding aircraft, which meant no disruption to combat readiness. In wartime, that was gold. Schilling's team grew. 3 engineers from Farnborough, 2 civilian mechanics, and an ever-expanding network of base crews who now treated her like a legend. They called her Miss Schilling to her face, the brass lady behind her back, and our miracle worker when she wasn't around. Her breast restrictors soon became known by a new name, Ms. Schilling's Orifice. It began as a crude joke from Sir Stanley Hooker, Rolls-Royce's brilliant but mischievous chief engineer. In true RAF fashion, the nickname spread faster than the part itself. Pilots scribbled it in logbooks. Mechanics etched it onto toolboxes. It became a kind of badge of honor, proof that their planes carried the thicks that made them faster, deadlier, and most importantly, alive. And it wasn't just the RAF that noticed. Across the channel, German intelligence officers began reporting unexplained improvements in British fighter performance. Pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwadron squadrons, once confident in their superiority, now found themselves hunted. Their reports mentioned Spitfires that no longer broke off dives and remained operational through prolonged negative G maneuvers. The Messerschmitt FA-109, once the terror of the skies, was losing its edge. For every brass washer installed, the balance of power shifted a little further. The Royal Air Force was no longer fighting with one hand tied behind its back. It was striking back with precision and fury. Every pilot who dove into combat that spring did so with confidence born not of orders or speeches, but of trust. Trust in a machine that finally worked the way it should. By April 20th, more than 2,000 Merlin engines had been modified. Engine failures and dives dropped to virtually 0. The RAF's kill-to-loss ratio tripled. The Air Ministry's monthly report described it bluntly. Improved fuel regulation system credited with saving significant operational losses. But among the men who actually flew, there was no question who deserved the credit. They all knew her name. And when they lifted off from the runways of southern England, the brass washer she'd designed was there with them, unseen, unheralded, but vital as the beating heart of the Merlin engine itself. That night, after 16 straight hours of work, Schilling sat alone on her Norton, staring at the darkened runway. The air was cold, her hands ached, her clothes smelled of oil and sweat. But above her, the sky was alive, the faint glow of distant contrails etched across the stars. She smiled to herself. She didn't need medals or recognition. She only needed the sound of those engines still running. That was enough. By May 1941, Beatrice Schilling's name was whispered with reverence in hangars across Britain. Yet officially, she remained a ghost, a civilian engineer buried in the paperwork of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, invisible to the public and nearly forgotten by her own superiors. Every squadron commander wanted her restrictors. Every pilot trusted her solution, but the Air Ministry avoided giving her public credit. The newspapers printed stories about the bravery of pilots, the brilliance of aircraft designers, the genius of Rolls-Royce, but never once mentioned the woman whose 50-cent brass washer had saved the Royal Air Force. Schilling didn't care. Recognition was never the point. What mattered were the statistics. Numbers that didn't lie, numbers that meant lives. Before her restrictor, engine failure during negative G maneuvers occurred in nearly 40% of diving attacks. After installation, it dropped to 0.4%. The difference between those two numbers was hundreds of pilots, men who now returned home from missions that just weeks earlier would have been their last. For Schilling, those were the only medals that mattered. Yet even as she supervised production and installation, she refused to slow down. At Farnborough, she continued research on carburetor efficiency, high-altitude performance, and supercharger modifications. She was tireless, methodical, and ferociously independent. Most of her colleagues, men decades her senior, were half in awe, half intimidated. She wasn't just the smartest engineer in the room, one technician later recalled. She was the one who made you realize how little you actually knew. Her stubbornness had been there since childhood. Born in Waterlooville, Hampshire in 1909, she had grown up in a family that valued curiosity over convention. At 14, she dismantled her first motorcycle in the backyard, rebuilt it, and raced it down the country road until her mother nearly fainted from panic. Her fascination with machines was instinctive. She didn't learn engineering from school books, but from grease, noise, and risk. Later, at university, she studied mechanical engineering at Manchester, one of only a handful of women in the country doing so. Professors doubted her. Fellow students mocked her. She outperformed them all. After graduation, she joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, an institution filled with brilliant minds and rigid hierarchies. She walked into a world that didn't know what to do with women who thought faster than men. The head of her department reportedly told her, "You'll be designing teapots before you touch a Merlin engine." Schilling responded by spending her weekends racing motorcycles and breaking records on the Brooklyn circuit. "If they won't let me fly," she once said, "I'll race something that can." Her work ethic was legendary. During long nights at the lab, she'd sit beside the engines as they screamed for hours, recording every fluctuation, every drop of pressure, every tremor. Colleagues said she had a sixth sense for engines. She could hear when something was off before the gauges showed it. That intuition, born from her racing days, was what led her to the restrictor. She understood how engines felt under stress, how they reacted when gravity shifted. It wasn't a guess, it was a mechanic's empathy. In the months that followed, her restrictor, Miss Schilling's orifice, became as famous among pilots as the Merlin engine itself. They spoke of it with affection, humor, and awe. Some carried spare washers in their pockets as good luck charms. Squadron leader Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the ARF's top aces, wrote in his logbook, "Dived on 3 109s today. Engine didn't quit once. Thank God for Miss Schilling." By the summer of 1941, the tactical balance in the air had completely shifted. RAF fighters now met the Luftwaffe on equal terms. British pilots could now pursue their prey through dives and inverted maneuvers without fear of their engines cutting out. Fighter Command's kill ratio tripled and morale soared. For the first time since the Battle of Britain, the men in the air felt they had the upper hand. But Schilling didn't stop there. She began visiting coastal stations, inspecting aircraft under the harsh conditions of sea air and salt corrosion. Her leather gloves were always stained with fuel, her notebook smudged with graphite. "She was everywhere," said an RAF mechanic. "Everywhere there was an engine that needed fixing, she was there, like a ghost in a brown coat." Still, there was a quiet loneliness beneath her relentless pace. In letters to friends, she rarely mentioned the war or her invention. She wrote instead about the road, about the sound of her motorcycle's engine echoing through empty lanes at dusk, about the feeling of freedom that came only with speed. For all her brilliance and defiance, she remained at heart a solitary racer who had never quite left the track. Then came the recognition she hadn't sought, but had earned beyond measure. In 1948, long after the war, King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, for her wartime contributions. At Buckingham Palace, she stood in her formal dress, the medal gleaming on her chest. Photographers called her name. She smiled politely, accepted the honor, and returned to work the next morning as if nothing had happened. The engineers at Farnborough joked that if you gave Schilling a medal, she'd probably use it as a gasket. They weren't wrong. She had no use for ceremony. Her life was measured not in awards, but in RPMs, in problem solving, in the lives that her work had quietly saved. Years later, when asked what she thought about being called the woman who saved the Spitfire, she laughed. "I didn't save anything," she said. "I just stopped the bloody engines from cutting out."
By the summer of 1941, the transformation of Britain's air war was undeniable. In every sky above the Channel, the roar of Merlin engines sang a different tune, one of consistency, confidence, and control. Pilots who had once feared the sudden silence of a dead engine now hurled their Spitfires and Hurricanes into impossible dives, knowing their power would hold steady through the chaos. The numbers told the story. RAF losses plummeted, German kill ratios dropped, and the word spread through the Luftwaffe: the British fighters don't stall anymore. It wasn't just a mechanical improvement, it was psychological warfare in its purest form. But what the reports didn't show was the quiet toll on the woman who had made it possible. Beatrice Schilling worked herself past exhaustion. She traveled from base to base on her motorcycle, often in freezing rain or choking fog, her small leather satchel stuffed with brass washers and blueprints. She slept in barracks, ate with mechanics, and spent her nights in hangars filled with the smell of oil and gunmetal. She inspected welds, recalibrated tools, and personally tested engines roaring inches from her face. She trusted no shortcuts, no assumptions, no bureaucratic comfort. If one installation failed, it wouldn't be because she hadn't checked it herself. She'd become both an engineer and a commander, commanding respect in a world where women were still treated as visitors in men's professions. But at Farnborough, where rank meant less than results, her word was law. "If Tilly says it works, one pilot declared, and if she says it doesn't, you'd better pray you're not flying it." Her authority was earned not through title, but through evidence, the kind that screamed across the sky at 400 miles per hour. That authority carried her beyond carburetors. Once the restrictor was standardized, the Royal Aircraft Establishment assigned her new challenges. She worked on fuel freezing problems in Arctic conditions, supercharger efficiency, and cold weather starting systems for aircraft stationed in Iceland and Murmansk. Each problem came with the same stakes. Failure meant death. She thrived under that pressure, chasing the edge of impossibility where engineering met instinct. In late 1941, she was asked to consult on high-altitude performance issues for late-model Spitfires. Pilots flying above 35,000 feet reported sudden power drops, inconsistent fuel flow, and overheating. Schilling diagnosed the problem within days. The air-fuel mixture was being miscalibrated at extreme altitudes. Her fix, a subtle modification to the carburetor's altitude compensation valve, increased engine output by 8% above 30,000 feet. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave British pilots an advantage where air was thin and survival thinner.
And yet for all her brilliance, Schilling remained invisible to most of Britain. The newspapers wrote about the engineers of Rolls-Royce and the genius of the Merlin, but not about the woman who had crawled inside those engines, who had bled for them. The RAF pilots knew, though. They never forgot. In squadron bars across England, when whiskey flowed and laughter softened the edges of grief, someone would raise a glass and say, "To Miss Schilling and her bloody orifice." The room would erupt in cheers. It was crude, affectionate, and absolutely heartfelt. Her marriage to George Naylor, a bomber pilot and fellow engineer, existed in parallel to her work. He flew Lancasters over Germany, missions where survival odds were worse than a coin toss. She never talked about her projects. He never described the flames over Hamburg or Cologne. They lived like two people in different wars, bound by silence and mutual respect. "We both knew enough to leave the nightmares where they belonged," she once said. By 1942, Schilling's restrictor had become a permanent fixture in the Merlin engine's production line. Rolls-Royce engineers incorporated it into their blueprints, calling it simply Flow Regulation Component. Official documents credited Lockheed Rolls-Royce collaborative improvements. Her name appeared nowhere. But she didn't seem to mind. "If I'd wanted fame," she told a colleague, "I would have raced cars instead of fixing them." Still, she took satisfaction in the numbers. By the end of 1942, over 2,100 aircraft had been equipped with her restrictor. Combat statistics revealed a staggering improvement. British pilots were now shooting down more than 3 German fighters for every 1 loss. The edge that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe was gone. The hunter was the hunted. German engineers noticed the shift too. Reports from the Daimler-Benz division in Stuttgart documented improved British carburation behavior and speculated on possible adoption of fuel injection principles. They never guessed that the true cause was not a massive redesign, but a woman in a brown coat with a wrench and a piece of brass. Even after the restrictor carburetor finally entered production in 1943, many squadrons refused to switch. They trusted Miss Schilling's orifice more than the new technology. "If it works, don't fix it," became the unofficial motto of Fighter Command. Pilots carried on flying with her restrictor through 1944, through D-Day, through the final battles of Europe. By then, Schilling had moved on to projects that stretched beyond the war itself. She worked on supercharger upgrades for the late-war Merlin variants, pushing efficiency to its limits. She studied the effects of fuel icing at high altitude, publishing technical papers that would influence post-war aviation for decades. Her mind never stopped, not even when the war ended and the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. But she would always be remembered by those who knew for that single act of rebellion, that sleepless night when she broke the rules and saved thousands of lives. When a 50-cent washer shaped by her hands gave the Lightning and the Spitfire their soul. Years later, when journalists asked her if she knew her restrictor would work, Schilling simply smiled. "I didn't know," she said. "I just refused to believe it wouldn't."
By 1943, the war in the skies had changed beyond recognition. What once seemed like a desperate scramble for survival had become a contest of refinement. Every advantage counted, every ounce of fuel, every second of thrust. The Merlin engine, once flawed and temperamental, was now a masterpiece of precision, and hidden within its heart, the brass washer that Beatrice Schilling had designed still quietly did its work. The RAF was now on the offensive, pushing across Europe, escorting bombers deep into occupied territory. Yet, amid the noise of triumph, there remained no headlines for the woman who had helped make it all possible. Schilling had never asked for recognition, but history has a cruel way of favoring generals over engineers. While aces became legends, while commanders were knighted, the people who built the machines remained in the shadows. And in those shadows, Schilling continued her work, quietly, relentlessly, obsessively. Her days at Farnborough were filled with new problems: fuel starvation at extreme altitudes, supercharger stress fractures, icing on carburetors in the freezing upper atmosphere. The stakes were as high as ever. Every improvement meant fewer letters home, beginning with, "We regret to inform you." When reports came in of Spitfires and Hurricanes being deployed to the Arctic, Schilling was assigned to design cold weather modifications.
she developed a system for preheating oil and adjusting fuel mixtures to prevent freezing, an innovation that allowed aircraft stationed in Iceland and Murmansk to fly in temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Pilots who had once abandoned missions because their engines seized now flew confidently over the snow-covered tundra. Her methods became standard practice across all northern bases. At the same time, she worked with Rolls-Royce engineers to fine-tune supercharger performance for late-war Merlins, improving climb rates and power output at high altitude. The result was breathtaking. The Spitfire Mark IX, powered by the upgraded Merlin 61, could now duel the Luftwaffe's new Focke-Wulf 190, the German fighter that had once outclassed everything in the RAF. In engineering circles, they called it the miracle of incremental genius. Dozens of small fixes, small acts of brilliance, each one invisible on its own, but together unstoppable. By the time the war was turning in the Allies' favor, Schilling's career had become a quiet symphony of such invisible victories. Her name appeared in none of the headlines. Her face never graced the newspapers. But the pilots who returned from combat, the ones who landed safely instead of crashing into the channel, they knew. They wrote to her. Short, simple letters, many unsigned, all heartfelt. Whatever you did, it worked. The engine never quit once. You saved my life. She kept those letters in a box in her office drawer, tucked beneath engine blueprints and test reports, like a secret collection of medals. Her husband, George Naylor, had survived his own ordeal, 31 bombing missions over Germany. When he returned in 1944, he was gaunt and gray-eyed, his distinguished flying cross a quiet reminder of how close he'd come to never seeing home again. They rarely spoke of the war. He never asked about the restrictor, she never asked about the men he'd lost. They shared a silent understanding that the machines they had both served, his Lancaster, her Merlin, had exacted their price. The end of the war in 1945 brought no peace to her restless mind. While the world celebrated victory, Schilling turned her attention to peacetime research. She worked on engine icing prevention, jet fuel regulation, and runway friction studies, problems that seemed mundane but saved lives just the same. Even in peacetime, she wrote, engines will always find new ways to kill their pilots. Her research on wet runway braking became a cornerstone for jet aviation safety, reducing landing accidents by nearly 30% in the 1950s. Yet for all her brilliance, promotion never came easily. The post-war bureaucracy had no place for a woman at the top. Senior positions were reserved for men with medals and titles. She was offered administrative work, which she refused, choosing instead to stay in the laboratory, where engines roared and ideas mattered more than hierarchy. Her male colleagues called her the Iron Woman of Farnborough, not out of insult, but admiration. She simply refused to stop. Her most unexpected project came in 1955, when the Royal Air Force asked her to design a bobsled for its Olympic team. It sounded absurd, a wartime engineer designing a winter sport vehicle, but to Schilling, physics was physics. She approached the problem with the same precision she'd given to the Merlin: aerodynamic drag, weight distribution, surface friction. The RAF bobsled didn't win medals, but it didn't crash either. Not crashing, she joked, is the engineer's equivalent of victory. Through the 1950s and 60s, she remained a fixture at Farnborough, the woman who never married her fame, only her work. Younger engineers idolized her, though few dared to tell her so. Her reputation was fierce, her expectations higher still. If you didn't come prepared, she recalled, she'd glare at you like a faulty carburetor. But when they got it right, she'd beam with pride and buy them tea from the cafeteria, her version of a medal ceremony. In 1969, after 33 years of service, Beatrice Schilling retired. Her farewell ceremony was modest, no band, no speeches, just a room full of colleagues clapping as she smiled awkwardly, her hair silver now and her hands still calloused from decades of work. She didn't say much that day, only this: engines are honest things. They tell you the truth if you listen long enough. Then she turned, walked out of the building, and never came back. She left behind more than blueprints. She left a philosophy that true engineering is not invention for glory, but problem-solving for survival. And though the world barely noticed her departure, the sound of engines overhead, reliable, roaring, alive, was her unspoken legacy.
When the engines finally fell silent and the last fighter of the war found its place in a museum, Beatrice Schilling's name was little more than a footnote in the archives of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Her invention, the tiny brass restrictor that had turned the Spitfire's weakness into strength, had saved lives across thousands of missions, yet the official histories gave her no more than a passing mention. To the bureaucrats, she had been just one of many engineers. To the pilots, she had been something else entirely. To them, she was the woman who gave the Merlin its soul. The years after her retirement unfolded quietly. She settled in a small house near Farnborough, where the distant hum of aircraft still echoed across the fields. The war had left its mark, not in medals or scars, but in the way she moved, deliberate and unhurried, as if still thinking through problems invisible to everyone else. Her garage became her sanctuary. Inside, beneath the smell of petrol and dust, stood her beloved Norton motorcycle, the same one she had raced at Brooklands before the war. It was the machine that had taught her everything she knew about engines, about precision, and about the thin line between motion and disaster. Neighbors often saw her tuning it on quiet afternoons, gray hair tied back, sleeves rolled, fingers still blackened with oil. She rarely spoke about the past, but once, when a curious boy asked why she spent so much time on an old bike, she smiled and said, "It still listens when I talk to it. That's more than I can say for most people." In 1980, a BBC journalist tracked her down for a short television piece about forgotten wartime inventors. They wanted her on camera standing beside a Spitfire explaining how her brass washer had changed the war. She refused. "The engine speaks for itself," she said. "I was just the translator." The segment ran without her. Viewers saw the planes, the pilots, the heroics, but never the woman whose hands had steadied the beating heart of those machines. Her husband, George Naylor, passed away in 1985. After his funeral, she sat alone in her house for days, surrounded by the quiet hum of memory. When she finally emerged, she returned to her garage and rebuilt the Norton engine from scratch, as if to remind herself that motion was still possible. She began writing technical notes again, part memoir, part manual, about the physics of carburetors, the logic of fuel flow, the philosophy of precision. She never published them. The notes, written in her small, neat handwriting, were found years later stacked in boxes beside the workbench. On the top sheet, she had written a single line. "Perfection is not achieved through complexity, but through understanding." When she died on November 18, 1990, at the age of 81, the newspapers carried small obituaries, most of them under 2 paragraphs. Beatrice Tilly Schilling, OBE, engineer and motorcyclist, developed the carburetor restrictor known as Miss Schilling's orifice, which improved the performance of RAF fighters during the Second World War. No grand tributes, no retrospectives. Yet among the surviving pilots who still met at reunions, her name was spoken with reverence. At the Battle of Britain Memorial Dinner in 1991, an elderly squadron leader raised his glass and said, "To Miss Schilling, who gave us our engines back." The hall went silent, then filled with applause that lasted nearly a minute. As time passed, her legacy began to re-emerge from obscurity. Aviation museums started displaying the small brass washer as part of their exhibits. Unassuming, about the size of a coin, labeled with quiet simplicity. Carburetor Restrictor, RAF, 1941. Designed by Beatrice Tilly Schilling. Engineering students at universities began studying her work as an example of elegant minimalist design. To them, her restrictor wasn't just a wartime artifact,
It was a symbol of creative defiance, proof that even the smallest act of insight could alter the trajectory of history. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Schilling, its walls decorated with photographs of hurricanes, Spitfires, and that famous Norton motorcycle. Patrons raised pints beneath her image, toasting the woman who had done what no regulation, no manual, no committee could. She had dared to fix what was good enough because she knew it wasn't good enough to save a life. In 2015, the Brooklands Museum acquired her racing trophies and Gold Star medals, displaying them beside a Spitfire engine fitted with an original restrictor. Visitors often stopped puzzled by the small brass ring on display. It seemed too insignificant to matter until they read the caption describing how it had kept engines running during combat dives and saved over 2,000 RAF pilots. Many left shaking their heads, marveling at how such a small thing could change so much. By 2019, nearly 80 years after that morning at RAF Kenley, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Schilling Building for electronic engineering students. On the opening day, a group of young women gathered beneath her portrait, a photograph taken in 1940, goggles around her neck, confidence in her eyes. And one of them whispered, "She looks like she knows something we don't." They were right. She had always known that the future belonged to those who built it, not to those who merely followed instructions. Today, Schilling's brass washer is more than a piece of metal. It is a philosophy made tangible. It teaches that progress isn't always born from invention on a grand scale, but from the courage to challenge assumptions, to defy rules written by those who never risked failure. The restrictor was never about glory. It was about survival, precision, and compassion, disguised as engineering. And somewhere in the quiet corner of an old workshop in Hampshire, her Norton still stands, the fuel tank polished to a dull gleam, the seat cracked with age. If you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the faint tick-tick-tick of cooling metal, like the heartbeat of a machine that refuses to die. In that sound lives her legacy, a reminder that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can echo longer than any roar of war.
History is often written in headlines, in the names of generals, politicians, and kings. Yet the true weight of history often rests in the hands of those who never make the front page. Beatrice Tilly Schilling was one of those hands, small, oil stand, steady even when the world shook. The war she helped win was not fought with bullets or bombs, but with patience, precision, and the courage to say, "This can be better." Her washer, no larger than a coin, costing less than a cup of tea, had done what entire committees and divisions of engineers had failed to achieve. It kept engines alive. It kept pilots breathing. It turned fear into control and chaos into rhythm. In the decades that followed her death, her name slowly began to resurface, carried not by fame, but by fascination. Every new generation of engineers stumbled across her story and felt something rare: humility. In lecture halls, professors held up the tiny brass restrictor and said, "This is engineering." Not because it was complex, but because it was simple. Because it embodied the essence of design, to find elegance in necessity. At the Imperial War Museum, one of Schilling's original restrictors now rests beside a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. A plaque reading, "Small minds built empires, great ones saved them." Visitors pause, whisper, and stare at the little ring of brass that saved an air force. For the pilots who lived, her name remains sacred. In their letters and memoirs, there were small, quiet mentions, fragments of gratitude that only other airmen would understand. "We trusted her more than gravity," one wrote. Another, decades later, recalled a mission over the Channel.
I remembered diving on a measurement. The G's pushed the blood from my head, but the Merlin sang. I suppose Miss Schilling was with me that day. In time, aviation historians began to reevaluate her role. They called her restrictor the most cost-effective innovation of World War II. Rolls-Royce engineers admitted privately that without her work, hundreds of pilots would have been lost before the pressure carburetor ever reached production. In wartime terms, she had accelerated victory by years, and done it not with an army, but with a washer. When asked in a post-war interview what had driven her to break the rules that morning at RAF Kenley, she gave the kind of answer that only someone like her could give. Because rules don't keep engines running. She paused, then added, "People do." It was the closest she ever came to philosophy, but those words would later appear etched on a small memorial plaque at Farnborough, placed there by engineers decades after she was gone. Beneath her name, it reads, "She made engines breathe when others made excuses." The washer itself, officially designated the RAE carburetor restrictor, became a teaching model in engineering schools worldwide. Students are asked to replicate it, to measure its aperture, to understand how something so small could counteract the effects of gravity and fuel surge. But the real lesson isn't in the math, it's in the mindset. It's in the realization that innovation often comes not from following orders, but from questioning them. In 2020, nearly 80 years after Schilling's invention, a new generation of engineers at Rolls-Royce honored her legacy by creating a digital simulation of the Merlin engine and its restrictor, using modern computational fluid dynamics. The results confirmed that what Schilling had known intuitively in 1941 was that her design was near perfect. Even with today's technology, they couldn't have improved it meaningfully without redesigning the entire engine. The engineers ended the presentation with a single sentence projected on the screen. She was right. Her legacy extends far beyond the war. For women in engineering, she became a symbol of quiet defiance, proof that talent needs no permission. Long before terms like gender equality entered the lexicon, she had already lived it, not through protest, but through performance. She never argued that women could do the job. She simply did it better than anyone else. In doing so, she opened doors she would never walk through herself, doors that others now pass through freely. Her story now circulates through documentaries, museums, and online communities dedicated to forgotten innovators. Yet even there, amid the admiration, there remains something hauntingly modest about her legend. She never patented the restrictor, never trademarked its name, never sought credit. "I did my job," she once said. "The pilots did theirs." That, perhaps, was the truest reflection of her character. A refusal to measure her life in glory when she could measure it in results. In the end, the washer became more than metal. It became metaphor. It stood for every small act of courage that goes unseen, for every person who fixes instead of complains, who acts instead of asking permission. In that sense, it's not just a story about war or about machines. It's a story about the kind of humanity that hides inside craftsmanship, about the way an engineer's mind can save a soldier's heart. If you stand today at an air show and hear the distant rumble of a Spitfire slicing through the clouds, you are hearing her voice, not in words, but in rhythm. The engine roars, the propeller spins, and beneath it all, deep inside, the airflow hums through a brass ring no wider than your thumb. That sound, that flawless, continuous hum, is her legacy. Her heartbeat turned mechanical. She once said that engines, like people, only run smoothly when treated with respect. And in a world that often rewards spectacle over substance, perhaps that is her final lesson. that greatness needs no noise. It only needs precision, purpose, and the courage to act when others hesitate. So when the last Spitfire fades into the horizon, leaving nothing but silence and the scent of fuel on the wind, remember this, that it was not just pilots who fought for the sky, but a woman with a wrench and a dream, who looked at a machine and whispered, "You can do better." And for one extraordinary moment in history, the sky listened.